The year was 1291, and the city of Acre stood as the last shimmering jewel of the Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land, a defiant fortress on the Mediterranean coast where Christian banners still fluttered against the encroaching tide of Islamic power. Once a place of wealth and faith, its harbor thrived with merchants, knights, and pilgrims, the air thick with the scent of spice and the echo of prayers whispered in Latin and Arabic alike. But beneath its golden surface lay fear, for all knew that the mighty Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, son of Kalawan, had sworn to finish what his father began to drive the Crusaders forever from the lands of Islam. As winter turned to spring, scouts brought word of an army vast beyond imagination, a sea of banners stretching across the plains of Galilee, with catapults, siege towers, and warriors hardened by years of conquest. Within Acre's walls, tension reigned. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers prepared their defenses, their Grand Masters issuing orders with grim resolve, while the city's citizens, Italians, Frenchmen, English, and Syrians, argued in the streets about whether to fight or flee. The sound of hammers echoed day and night as walls were reinforced, gates were barred, and the harbor filled with ships ready to evacuate those who lost their nerve. On April 5th, the Mamluk army arrived, its vanguard spreading across the hills like a living wave of steel. Their drums thundered through the earth, a sound like the heartbeat of destiny itself. From the citadel, one could see the glint of sunlight on endless rows of lances, banners of green and black rippling in the sea wind. The siege began. Stone after stone from the Muslim mangonels crashed against Acre's walls, shaking towers that had stood for a century. The defenders answered with fire and arrows, crossbow bolts whistling into the mass of attackers below, the air filled with the screams of the dying and the roar of flames as siege engines burned. For weeks, both sides bled under the relentless sun. The Mamluks dug trenches and filled them with wooden shields to protect their advance, while miners worked beneath the walls to set charges that would bring them crashing down. Inside the city, disease began to spread, food grew scarce, and despair crept into every corner. Yet still the defenders held. Led by the fearless Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu, the Templars launched daring night raids, slipping through breaches to set Mamluk towers ablaze before retreating to the safety of their walls. Beaujeu himself was wounded, his armor dented and bloodied, but his spirit unbroken. He reminded his men that Acre was not just a city, it was the last sanctuary of Christendom in the East, and to lose it would be to lose everything. The Pope had promised reinforcements, but none came. The kings of Europe were too busy with their own wars, their own crowns. The defenders were alone. By early May, the situation had grown desperate. The Mamluks had breached the outer wall in several places, and their sappers had tunneled under the great towers, setting them ablaze from beneath. Smoke rose day and night, and the once proud city became a ruin of broken stones and burning timbers. Still, the knights refused to yield. They fought in the streets, turning every corner, every ruined house into a fortress. The women and children prayed in the cathedrals, begging for a miracle that never came. Beaujeu, gravely wounded, refused to abandon his post. "I am not fleeing," he told his men as he pressed his hand against his bleeding side. "I am dead, but still, I fight." And so, with the enemy pouring through the shattered walls, the battle raged on, a storm of swords, fire, and faith that would decide the fate of the Holy Land. Dawn broke over Acre on May 18, 1291, not with a promise of salvation but with the heavy stillness of doom. Smoke rose from the shattered battlements, mingling with the salty breath of the sea, while within the city walls the Crusaders prepared for their final stand. The outer defenses were gone, reduced to heaps of stone and ash. The once mighty towers leaned like dying giants, and the cries of the wounded echoed through every street. The Mamluk army surrounded the city on every side, thousands upon thousands of warriors under the green banners of Islam, their armor gleaming, their war drums pounding like the heartbeat of the earth itself. From his command tent, Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil watched the city with cold, unwavering eyes. He knew that this day would be written in history as the day Islam reclaimed the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. Behind him stood his generals, seasoned men who had fought in Syria and Egypt, ready to unleash their fury upon Acre until no Christian flag remained. Inside the city, the defenders gathered for what all knew was the end. The Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers stood side by side at the Church of St. Cross, their faces grim beneath their helmets as the priests offered the final mass. The bells rang, not in triumph, but as a requiem. Knights kissed their swords, whispering prayers to the Virgin and to St. George. The people, merchants, sailors, women, and children crowded the harbor, desperate to escape, begging the Genoese and Venetian ships to take them away. But chaos ruled the docks. Ships overturned, fights broke out, and the cries of the dying drowned out all reason. Meanwhile, the Mamluk catapults began their final barrage, stones the size of oxen crashing into the heart of the city, splintering towers and crushing anyone caught below. Dust filled the air, turning day into twilight. Then, with a sound like thunder, the Mamluk infantry surged forward. They stormed through the breaches, climbing over piles of corpses and rubble, their battle cries shaking the very walls. The Templars met them head-on in the ruins of the gatehouse, their white mantles stained crimson. Swords clashed, shields splintered, and the narrow streets became rivers of blood. Grand Master Beaujeu, though already mortally wounded, led one final charge. He swung his sword with the strength of a man possessed, cutting through the enemy ranks, until, struck in the chest by a spear, he fell to his knees. "I am dead," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the din. "But God lives." His knights formed a circle around him, fighting to the last man. When the Mamluks finally broke through, they found the bodies of the Templars piled like stones, each one facing the enemy, none with his back turned. The fall was total. The Hospitallers withdrew to their fortress near the harbor, defending it with desperate courage, buying time for the remaining civilians to flee by sea. But the ships were too few, and the Mamluks too many. Flames devoured the waterfront as siege engines hurled firepots into the docks. Women screamed, children clung to their fathers, and the sea turned black with smoke and corpses. By nightfall, the city that had once been the crown of the Crusader states was a burning graveyard. Only the Templar citadel by the sea still stood, its walls battered but unbroken. For 10 more days, the knights within held fast, refusing every offer of surrender. The Sultan, enraged by their defiance, ordered massive siege towers brought forward. The Templars fought on until the towers reached their gates, until fire rained from above and the sea walls began to crumble beneath the pounding waves. At last, on May 28th, the Mamluks stormed the citadel. The final defenders, perhaps a few hundred knights and brothers, fought like lions. When the walls finally collapsed, the Templars ignited their own powder stores, bringing down the fortress upon themselves and their enemies alike. The explosion shook the entire coastline, a final defiant roar of the Crusader age. When the smoke cleared, Acre was no more. The streets were silent except for the crackle of burning timbers and the call of carrion birds. The Sultan entered the ruins in silence, dismounted, and prayed upon the ashes of the fallen. The crescent had triumphed over the cross. The news of Acre's fall spread like wildfire across Europe. Kings wept, popes raged, and poets wrote dirges for the lost city. But no army was sent to reclaim it. The Crusades, which had begun 2 centuries earlier with the dream of conquering the Holy Land, ended there on the blood-stained stones of Acre. The survivors fled to Cyprus, carrying with them relics, banners, and sorrow. The Mediterranean wind whispered through the ruins 4 centuries after, telling the tale of courage and pride, of faith and fire. The Battle of Acre was not merely the end of a city, it was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter written in blood and belief. The moment when the last echo of the Crusader spirit faded into history, and though the walls of Acre fell, its story lived on, immortal, a reminder of how empires rise, how faith drives men to glory and ruin alike, and how the sea remembers the cries of those who fought to the very end.